a different subject for today's 10-minute daily drawing exercise, and that's this car. Now, cars are often perceived as being difficult to draw, and I think it's because that for most of us, we have a fairly practical and passing awareness and knowledge of cars, but we haven't really studied them unless they're a particular passion, which means when we come to draw, we think we know what a car looks like. But really, what we're thinking of is thousands and thousands of memories of all sorts of cars in all sorts of circumstances and positions and conditions. But it's easy when we draw to, in our head, hold a sense that we know what we're seeing. And therefore, when we look at the photo, we think we've seen enough, but we haven't seen enough to draw it accurately. And when we go to draw, we're drawing as much from our memories of cars and assumptions of how cars look as we are about this particular car. Very often, we're drawing a car that might be accurate enough, but it's not actually in the same position. It's not at the same angle of view as in our reference. And so the proportions start to get wrong. Now you can see what I'm doing here. I'm thinking, okay, if the windscreen is this high, then this next bit is this proportion of that height. And I'm using that to get this first line across. Now, I deliberately didn't take a straight-on view of the car because that would have been so much easier to draw and have needed so much less observation. But the thing is now that the left and the right-hand sides of the front of the car look different because we're seeing one curving away more, the right-hand side, and they don't line up precisely on the windscreen with each other. And what we see of the moulding of the car, particularly on the bonnet, also changes. So I deliberately introduced a few difficulties with this to force us to observe. And all the time, I'm referencing off the windscreen. The windscreen, I thought, was the most straightforward part of the car to draw with some degree of accuracy. And what I want to do is not have my car look like some sort of blob at the end, which is always the danger with cars these days. When I was a lad, they were all quite angular and square and boxy, but now they're all somewhat rounded, and yet they do have a certain aerodynamic leanness to them as well. And so we want to capture that and not have them look like semi-inflated marshmallow cars. So all the while I'm paying attention to where things line up with what I've drawn. I'm drawing with a 0.3mm pen, I do believe. And so, as I said, these front headlights, the assemblies look different from each other. On this left-hand assembly, we see the two round lights with a space between them. But when we look at the right-hand one, in fact, one is slightly tucked behind the other, and that's because the larger one is set back slightly from the smaller one. And so if we don't notice that, we don't incorporate that. And that also means that the total width of the headlight assembly on the right-hand side is narrower than on the left-hand side. And again, these are the sorts of things we need to observe. We need to even be aware to look out for them if we're to successfully get a car that looks like we're looking at it mostly front on, but not quite. And of course, when we do the side, the left-hand side of the car, there's an awful lot of foreshortening happening there. The car is moving away very quickly, and therefore the distortion is more pronounced as it moves further away. And the temptation will be to draw more car than we can actually see down the side, because when we look at that, we know in our mind what that looks like from a side-on view, and it's going to be very tempting not to draw at least some of what we see in that side-on view by extending the width of the various elements. And so alignment with what we've already drawn is going to be even more particularly important when we do that, both vertically and horizontally. But for now, I'm trying to finish doing across the front of the car. The other thing I don't want to do, because I'm working down, if you like, in horizontal bands, I want to make sure that I don't get line creep or height creep as the bands go down, and we end up with a car that's sitting too high off the ground, where the windscreen looks much higher off the ground than it really is. So we're now ready for the wheels, but it is a bit tricky too, because the proportions don't look quite right until we've finished off, if you like, the left-hand side of the front of the car back to the wheel cavity. I know there's a better word for it than that, but that will have to do for now. So now I'm adding just the extra height to the roof and trying to really just look at these angles and to see them as, like I often talk about, we should try and see the form, but when I draw cars, I try to see the shapes, the two-dimensional shapes, and disconnect them from being part of a car and just see them as an outline that encloses a certain object, a certain shape, and to copy that shape. And as I said, try not to think that it's a car, that it's part of a car. And so with this, wheel well, that's what they're called. With this wheel well, notice that I haven't taken this further back line straight down, because in fact the car angles to the right at this point, and the wheel being straight up and down blocks the view of the very bottom corner of the far side of the wheel well. And so I've left room for that. And there I go now, just crossing the T, so to speak. And again, they're the sorts of difference, or the sorts of distinctivenesses about this view that we want to see and capture, because they also give the visual clue as to the degree of foreshortening. And if we were further around, we would actually see that dark band going the whole way to the bottom of the car. And if we draw it because we presume it's there without having looked at it, then we've introduced, if you like, a visual distortion now, where we're seeing more of the car than we should see, or we're seeing details that we don't see from this view, that we'd see from another view, a more side-on view. And that creates a sense of there's something not quite right with this car at the end. And if we do it in several different places, then we can introduce a feeling of there's a lot not quite right with this car. And that's when we start to get cars that look a bit bloated, a bit puffed up, a bit like there's bits added on that aren't as sleek and as well-fitting as they should be. Now we can check angles with our pen, any angles at all. They don't have to be perspective angles. And that's a pretty high-angled line, that one at the bottom of the car. And again, you see, because we know the car is, that line is parallel to the ground, and that's a horizontal line if we're looking side onto the car, it's easy, if we haven't truly observed the angle that we have from this view, to draw that line that's more horizontal, in the direction of the horizontal, than it should be. And then we also need to make sure that the back wheel doesn't come down too far, because it's also a lot smaller than the front wheel, plus because of the angle, we're actually basically looking down on this car. I'm pretty certain eye level is going to be just above the roof line of the car. That also affects the way the wheels line up. And so now I made that side mirror come out from the car too much. And that's now skewing our perception. And I actually took the that back window line too far out, because it needed to basically almost come past the mirror. But because the mirror was too far out, the angles come out slightly too far. What I should have done was just acknowledge the fact that the mirror is out a bit far, but put that back line still where it should have been in relation to the rest of the car. Because that back corner of the car looks as if it does come out just a little bit too far. So now I'm doing these headlights, and I'm able to add the fact that on the right-hand side, from this angle, it sits a little behind the smaller one. because it does stagger back slightly, and therefore this position changes things. Presumption is the enemy of accuracy in our drawings, where we end up drawing what we think we've seen, not what we've actually seen. And if you're finding this helpful, please hit the like button for me. I don't draw cars easily, so I'd appreciate the encouragement. And now a few shadows. Look, we're almost at our 10 minutes. And then we go into double time. And I think we're in double time now. I think it's looking a bit quick and zippy for how I can draw cars with any accuracy. Yeah, we're doing now behind the windscreen. One of these days I'll have to do a whole video on dealing with behind the windscreen when we draw with pen, but I really didn't have time to capture the effect of what we're seeing using an ink line in one of these exercises. But we have the same problem in streetscape with shops, where shop windows, particularly when they're closer to us, have a varying amount of detail that we can see through them, just depending how the light's reflecting. And sometimes we can actually have reflections from across the road bouncing off, but we can also partly see in other parts of the window where the lighting, for one reason or another, is different. So that can be very challenging when we just have a thin black line to create the effects that we create. We don't want to leave them blank, but equally we don't want to fill them all in with an even darkness either. So this is pretty much it. Here we have our car. Are you going to have a go? You'll find the photo on my channel community page. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Some of you will have drawn a lot of cars because you love them. For others, it will be an unfamiliar subject, as it is for me, and always a challenge. But even more, if that's the case, have a go drawing them. Why not? The most you can do is learn. So let's give learning a go. That's the whole point of these exercises. And if we don't do so well, we can do it again. But whatever we do, make sure we have fun. Bye.